Welcome back, everyone. Ep17 from United States of America. So nice to have you back.
Good to be back and in the same time zone.
Yeah, super fun. So today we're digging into a really interesting topic, almost like two sides of the same coin. One is we're going to talk about proselytes or converts, people who come to Judaism, and we're going to talk about um, crypto Jews or conversos, people who are hidden Jews, people who are Jewish, but you don't know they're Jewish. So we're going to take a look at some of the history of that, both in different communities around the world. But maybe where should we start with that? Should we talk first about one or the other, or do their stories connect in some way?
I mean, I would start with just using this. The terminology maybe is a good place to begin. You use the term crypto. People know cryptocurrency, but it comes
Right.
from it comes from the Greek word kryptos, which is hidden. I don't know if it's related to crypt, where they bury bodies. I haven't looked, I'm not
Interesting.
that of the etymology of that word. But
Hmm.
there's many different words used, but that's the most common word. Hidden Jews. What does it mean? It means people who may not today be openly identifying as Jews, but have Jewish ancestry, which is almost always, without exception, a byproduct of some form of persecution. The most famous example and the largest number of crypto Jews are a byproduct of the Jewish experience in Spain, which culminated, in 1492, in July 31st, 1492, with the expulsion of the Jews of Spain. But the process actually began over 100 years before. We'll talk about that. But from that, we got a lot of other terms, which we also conflate into that. Moranos, which is a word I looked at. I was looking at the etymology of that word. People say it means in Spanish swine. I don't believe that's the word for swine in Spanish.
Hmm.
I think part of it's from Arabic, muhram, which is forbidden, and it's somehow connected. I think in Islam, forbidden isn't food because Muslims don't eat pork. There's some connection there. And also in Spanish to the word mora or something. I'm not a Spanish speaker, which means to fail or deviate. But that's a word used. But we have this idea of bnei anusim in Hebrew, those who were forced. So conversos is the other word, people who
Hmm.
converted. So that is a really the term. Those are terms that specifically come out of the experience of Spain, which was the largest example of massive forced conversion. But there
Hmm.
are other examples throughout Jewish history which have led to a situation where we fast forward over the thousands of years that we've wandered and been scattered from place to place. There are now tens of millions of people scattered around the world, some of them more focused in certain geographic areas, like we were talking before the show started about that article you sent me. But it's something that's well known in South America, Central America, Southeast United States, but even places like parts of Europe, and places like Sicily that have communities of people who seem very much to be of Jewish ancestry. And we're not talking about the intermingling of Jewish DNA with other people's DNA, which is a separate process, which wasn't through a forced process, but through people converting into the Jewish people. I think, Ellie, we mentioned previously that genetically, because Ashkenazim, those, which is the term meaning Germany, but it's actually Jews who grew up in the Christian world, primarily of Europe, excluding Spain until it went back to being Christian.
Hmm.
Um, but that the Ashkenazi Jewish world, Ashkenazi Jewish men are like 45 to 75% genetically Italian, because it has to
Interesting.
do with the whole historical process, which we don't want to go back into now, of much of the Ashkenazi community is based on the destruction of the Second Temple, and many Jews often sold as slaves going through the Roman Empire to Rome itself and then spreading into Germany. So in the course of that process, and this is not unique to Ashkenazim, it's also with Sephardim, the Jews, which
Hmm.
is the term which means Spain, but the more broad term is Edot Mizrach, the communities of the East, which are communities of Jews that lived in the diaspora, scattered around the Middle East, North Africa, and Spain until 1492, who also significantly intermingled with the local indigenous populations. So that
Right.
certainly has led to uh, a lot of Jews having non-Jewish DNA.
Hmm.
Jews willingly opting out of Judaism, which has happened
Right.
multiple times throughout history, but has certainly led to a lot of people in today, the intermarriage rate amongst non-Orthodox Jews in America is like 70%. So there are many children who have Jewish blood, but are not halachically Jewish, meaning their mother isn't Jewish. But we're talking about a
Well,
process whereby people who were uh, Jews and wanted to stay Jews, weren't married, hadn't married out or married intermingled, were
right,
just basically forced to convert into
right.
another faith. Most of those examples are in Christianity, and the best example would, of course, be Spain.
And I think if I read correctly, if I think you mentioned this, that the name Marano was the name that was given to the Sephardic Jews, but the Sephardic Jews that were forced to convert, I think they called themselves Anusim, which means like the forced ones,
Yeah,
right? Like that was just a different name for them altogether. And I think it's so interesting that you're mentioning also people who have Jewish blood that don't necessarily know. I actually ran into a woman last week who used to babysit my kids, and her family is Jamaican. And she lives with her mom and her grandmother and da 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 da. And years ago, she came over to us and she would come and have dinner with us and watch the kids and da da da. And she came in one day and she said, "Oh, by the way, I found out the other day that I'm Jewish." And I was like, "What?" And so it ends up her great grandmother, who is still alive, is a white Jamaican Jew named Hadassah, who married a Jamaican guy. And so all of the women from Hadassah are technically Jewish, but she had no idea. They were raised Christian, very religious, very connected to like the church. But it was just, it's wild when you meet people and they're like, "Oh, by the way," and they don't have any framework for what that even means for them.
yeah.
Right. As Jews, we get super excited. Hey, welcome home. Come back to the family. But for them, it's like, it doesn't really mean anything because they don't know anything about it, which is so fascinating.
That's funny. It's funny you mentioned that because you're talking about Jamaica, and we're getting a little out of order here. But Jamaica, we think of Jamaica, we think of reggae, we think of Bob Marley, you think of Rastafarians, who, by the way, they have very much a lot of. You listen to Bob Marley's music, Zion Train is coming our way, and
Right.
he's quoting often from the Bible. And Rastafarianism is a kind of a black messianic movement of returning. They view Jamaica as Babylon and going back to Zion, going back to Africa
Yeah. The
movement.
Lion of Zion. Yeah.
But predating all of that is the fact that Jamaica was given to Christopher Columbus, who is of Jewish ancestry, also
Mm,
very possibly a crypto Jew himself, as a
right.
payoff by Ferdinand and Isabella, going back to like 1493 for
Right.
accidentally discovering the New World, and is one of the oldest Jewish settlements in the Western Hemisphere. So the fact that fast forward, hundreds of years later, and we'll get to that, we'll go back and rewind through that. We have people who you'd never think were Jewish coming from the wildest places who actually are. And all of
Yeah.
this is not to be confused again with the notion of converts, because how do we explain the tremendous diversity? Although all Jews have common genetic connections with each other, Ashkenazim and Sephardim, whatever. It goes back to our Middle Eastern roots, which have been augmented and altered by people marrying into the Jewish people, which is the convert story. So it's kind of an
Hmm.
interesting twist to that. But we have this fascinating phenomenon of, again, hundreds of millions of people around the world, hundreds of millions, I would say, absolutely. I think it's Bibi Netanyahu, the current prime minister of Israel's father, Ben Sion, who was arguably one of the greatest historians of Sephardic Jewry. I believe he threw out some figure. The problem is it's hard to pin down these numbers of, South and Central America and the Caribbean. It's a lot of countries, by the way. People don't realize how many countries are in. I think there's like 25 countries listed in North America. People saying U.S., Canada. No, it's Mexico. It's all this,
Right. Right.
Belize. There's all these little countries that are stuck in there in the Caribbean that are also considered part of North America. But that's 660 million people approximately. And I've seen figures that that's 200 million. He's claimed that a very significant percentage of the population of the Caribbean, of Central America, and of the Southeast United States is this crypto-Jewish population. So maybe we
Mm,
should like focus on that as a great example of this whole crypto-Jewish phenomenon, because that's the overwhelming majority of the people who would fall into this category of crypto-Jews or B'nai Anusim would be these people who are a byproduct of the Jewish experience in Spain. So again,
mm,
maybe Ellie, to rewind, we've talked about this before, but how did Jews get to Spain? We know that Jewish people, we are a nation. We're not just a faith. We entered the land of Israel going back 3,300 years ago. We stayed in the land of Israel for more than 1,200 years between what is the period of Judges, the first temple period, the second temple period. With the destruction of the first temple, which goes back about 2,500 years. We have the creation of the first Jewish diaspora community, which is in Babylon, which is the origins of the Iraqi Jewish community today, which predates the arrival of Islam and Arabs to that part of the world by a very long time, by the way. So those are Jews who were there, who stayed there literally until like 1948. but, but you have the reestablishment 70 years later of the Second Temple period, a 420-year period where the population of Israel swells tremendously again. But then you have the Greeks coming, the Romans come, you have three major revolts against the Roman Empire between the year 66 and 135, which lead to the decimation of a good chunk of Israel and either the enslavement of a good chunk of the Jews or the fleeing or expulsion of a significant percentage of the population. So, and even during the Roman Empire, before the revolts, you had Jews who were living in the Middle East, the entire Middle East, in North Africa, as the Roman Empire as expands and controls the Mediterranean. First century before the Common Era, first and second century after. Jews are spreading also throughout that. So this is the origins of these communities that are spread out, but with the destruction of Israel and the loss of autonomy and the tremendous depopulation of the land, the entire demographics of the Jewish world will then switch to diaspora. And again, most Jews initially, when we leave Israel, are living close to home, right across the Mediterranean, places like Italy and Greece, in places like Sicily and Cyprus, in places that are today like Turkey, the Middle East, and countries that are modern countries like Iraq, Syria, Lebanon. These did not exist back then. Um, and of course, through North Africa. With the advent of Islam, which is founded in 622, and its rapid expansion through the late 7th and early 8th centuries, by 750, Islam has gobbled up the whole Middle East. In 711, the Muslims will cross from Tangiers into what is the Gibraltar of today and conquer what is the Andalusia, the what is mostly what is considered Spain of today, and they will be there for the next 700 years. Jews will already have been living in Spain uh, during the Roman Empire, living persecuted under the Visigoths, who were these very radical, hardcore Christians. The Muslims come in; they're very relatively liberal. The Jews who are living in Spain support the Muslim conquest, and you'll have what's called the Golden Age of Spain from the 8th to the 11th centuries, when there's a great symbiotic relationship between, in places like Cordoba, in Spain, where you have the Muslims who are very tolerant, the Umayyad dynasty will allow Jews and Christians who normally would live under subjugation as dhimmi to basically act pretty freely. And you'll have this incredible cross-pollination and science and literature and poetry and astronomy and medicine and you name it. It's largely the Renaissance is a byproduct of the pollination of the rediscovery of the Islamic world, of the classical knowledge of Greece and Rome, often spread by Jews who are acting as translators, pouring that information back into Europe. So it's a really nice period of time, the Golden Age, as we call it, very unusual in history. But the Christians, remember, Spain is not a united country, will start to reconquer Spain almost immediately after the Muslims move in, and it takes again 700 years from 711 to the fall of Granada in 1492 till the Muslims lose all control of Spain. They're not actually expelled until the 17th century. They stay longer than Jews. But with the Christian reconquest, there is a lot of persecution. I should hit the pause button, Ellie, and talk about how in the 12th century in Spain, when it's still largely controlled by Muslims, the Almohades, who are Berbers, Berber Muslims, Berbers are not really Arabs, they're North African indigenous people, will cross into Spain and conquer from the more moderate Muslims a lot of Spain. And they will introduce an idea which is not really in Islam, a forced conversion. That's, by the way, when when Maimonides flees. Maimonides will flee Spain in 1148 when he's young, very young. Um, Relatively speaking, he's born 1135, I believe. His family will leave to escape Almohadi persecution. But then there's this massive forced conversion of Jews in Almohadi occupied Spain, which will cause the Rambam Maimonides to write this famous letter, which is called Igeret Hashmad. Shmad is the word for like spiritual destruction. It's a Jewish concept. When the non-Jews go after Judaism, which is what the Greeks did to the Jews in the Hanukkah story, and it's a letter supporting a lot of these Jews to avoid death would
Mm,
convert it to Islam. But
right.
and by the way, converting to Islam is really easy. You just have to say La ilaha illallah wa Muhammad Rasul Allah twice. There is no God but God. Muhammad is his messenger, and you're
Right.
Muslim.
Right.
It's another interesting discussion because Jewish law allows people to violate almost all the commandments to save your life,
Hmm.
except for three, which are murder. Someone says, kill him or I'll kill you. Someone says, sleep with this guy's wife, illicit sexual relations. You have to die for that also. And the
Hmm.
third is idolatry. Someone says, bow down to this idol or I'm going to kill you, you die. So I don't want to get the whole halachic discussion of Jewish law about, but there's an argument. Maimonides clearly does not hold that Islam is idolatrous.
Hmm.
I mean, their idea of God is very monotheistic. And he wrote this letter, which, by the way, flew against the majority opinion of many of the Jews of Maghreb, of North Africa, who condemn these Jews for doing this and not martyring themselves. He basically wrote this letter to strengthen them in their decision. But this is an early Arab Jewish, Jewish, Mizrahi Jew mass conversion into
Right.
Islam, and these are Jews who their conversion was meaningless to them, and they
Hmm.
created this dual identity, which will be kind of the paradigm that we're going to see in a much larger scale if we fast forward a couple of hundred years later to see what happens in under Christians' reoccupation of Spain going to the 14th and 15th centuries.
I think it's interesting also just to note that, yeah, the conversion processes of Christianity and Islam just have to do with saying you believe. And I think this goes to what Rabbi Sachs often speaks to, which is Judaism is both deed and creed. And so, as a convert myself, when you convert to Judaism, you have to do things. You have to, practice Judaism. You have to keep the halachas. You have to go to the mikveh. You have to you're signing a contract and a covenant with Hashem. So it's a really interesting thing that the conversos, in a way, it's just like, okay, fine, I can say that, but it's not what we do. It's not doing something that is, technically compromising my practice as a Jew, which is both deed and creed, if that makes sense. It's just interesting that
Yeah,
that was possible because the conversions of these religions you just say something and you're in.
you're very true on that, but it's also made it complicated for crypto Jews because they will talk. When we get to talk about Spain more, we'll see because Judaism prohibits certain things and demands certain other things. Crypto Jews will develop a whole kind of way of hiding what they're doing and trying to fool, most cases, Christians, a lot of time priests and things who are watching these new Christians to make sure that they're not going back or secretly practicing. So it's true, it's a different challenge because if all Judaism was a matter of belief, I'll just say these words, but I'll continue to believe otherwise. Unfortunately, or I mean, fortunately for us, we have all the mitzvot, but unfortunately, if you're trying to be a crypto Jew, there's things you can't eat, the stuff you can't
Right.
do,
Right.
and we'll talk about that as we go on. But it's very very correct. But really, one of the earlier examples of forced conversion on a significant scale is actually the Almohades, fanatic Muslims who are going after the Jews of Spain. But if we fast forward, and we have to recognize Spain, when Jews cross in 711 after the Muslims conquer into Spain, it's a real outlier community. Today we look at America as the center of the Jewish world outside of Israel. But, and if we go back to Christopher Columbus, America was about as outlier as you could get for Jews to be in. There was no kosher food, no Orthodox Union giving supervision to 400,000 products or whatever they do. So Spain was really out there. The center of the Jewish world at this period of time is no longer Israel. There's no longer any Jewish Supreme Court Sanhedrin. There's no Jewish government there. By this period of time, different Muslim dynasties are dominating the Middle East. The Crusaders will show up in the middle for about less than 100 years. But the center of the Jewish world is going to be Bavel. It's going to be basically what is more or less Iraq. Iran a little, but mostly what is Iraq. So this is an outlier community. But we see the whole history, and we've talked about this history of Jewish migrations as a situation, as Jews are welcomed in and opportunities economic are open to them and freedom of religion is allowed, which is what's going on under the Golden Age, which is not only great for the host country, but great for the Jews. This is not just a story in Spain. This is going to be what happens later with Poland, with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth founded in the mid-16th century, where they invite in Jews en masse and give them incredible terms of settlement and great economic opportunities. So Spain will, interestingly enough, go from this outlier community, because Jews can't live in a place with no Torah infrastructure. There's no rabbis and no shuls and no schools and no mikvahs. But these processes often take time. Fast forward a few hundred years later, fast forward to the 14th century, late 14th century, before the persecutions begin. And there's probably, we don't have exact demographics, but there's probably something like a 500,000 Jews living in Spain. That's insane. I mean, France is the only country in Europe today that has anything like that as a Jewish population. But the world's population at that time was maybe 500 million people. And there was as few as 900,000, and maybe the highest number I've seen is 2 million. I think it's somewhere between 1 million and 1.5 million Jews in the world. But it could be that almost half the Jews in the world are living in Spain by the late 14th century. That's crazy. And that becomes the center. And if you look at who all these great rabbis are, the Rambam being a great example, all what are called the Rishonim from the 11th to the late 15th century, these are people who are all, the Ramban, the Rambam, there's so many, go to Rehavia, the neighborhood in Jerusalem, all the street names are named. Most of these guys are Sephardic rabbis from places like Cordoba. This became the center of the Jewish world, culturally the center of the Jewish world, religiously. But with the Reconquest, there's a lot of backlash because it's a religious war between Christians and Muslims. There's a lot of fanatic religious faith, and the Jews fall out in the middle, being the center. So in places like Castile and throughout Spain, and a lot of people aren't aware of this, in the 14th century, there's massive anti-Jewish violence. Tens of thousands of Jews are killed, and possibly hundreds of thousands will forcibly convert to save their lives or avoid expulsion. So by the time we fast forward to 100 years later, which is the
Right.
Alhambra decree we'll get to now, it could be that Spain had already lost half of its Jewish community by then. But if we fast forward to 1492, after hundreds of years of fighting back and forth, Granada falls to the unified kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, which is Ferdinand and Isabella, who, by the way, some people speculate also had Jewish blood. There was so many Jews mixed in. Their relation,
Mhm.
apparently their marriage, I've read, was set up by court Jews, thinking that partial Jews ruling Spain would be good. Didn't work out well. Not to go into that, but
I just want to
yeah,
throw in, I
sure.
think, because we're always trying to relate it to what's happening today, so many people can't imagine a situation where Jews are told convert or die.
Mm,
Um, but let's be really honest. There is a certain movement with the Jewish population right now, which is give up your Zionism or be expelled from these institutions, from jobs, from certain positions of power. That, like, there is a certain right now convert or die type of paradigm that's happening in North America, which is if you don't give up what you believe in and adhere to our orthodoxy of Zionism is bad, Israel is bad, the only good Jews are the ones that denounce it. I think we can get a little tiny sense of what that must have been like for thousands and thousands of Jews to be told either you become Christian, or you can't work, or you can die, or you have to get out, or you have to leave. I certainly Jews in Europe are experiencing that. You either give up your Judaism or you got to get out.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely. There's correct thought. As you say, although I would argue that the anti-Zionism is just the last excuse that anti-Semitism is hiding behind, and the real
yeah,
attack is against Jews in general. Yeah, and if you
for
want to
sure.
opt out, that has often saved people physically. I'm not going to talk about the spiritual consequences of opting out. By the way, even if you convert out of a true desire to believe in Jesus, you get baptized 100 times, you're still going to be Jewish.
Right,
You can't opt out. I would say it's a spiritual genetic reality that you cannot change.
right. It's a
So,
Hotel
but
California.
you can marry a Jewish guy can marry a non-Jewish woman and have non-Jewish children, in which case your line dies with you. But your children will carry on the Jewish connection, which may in the future well turn out to be the converts whose souls want to find their way back to their original origin, which is tying in this whole thing together. But yeah, so definitely, you're right. We're definitely getting a taste of this coercive ideology. Although here it's not coming from a religious perspective. It's like a certain political ideology that you have to buy into if you want to be in. Otherwise, you're out.
And let's be honest, politics is religion in the United States at this point. So,
Definitely, there's definitely very close connection between the two. There's a very close connection. That's a very interesting discussion, also. By the way, we should have that in the future. But with
mhm.
Spain, in 1492, with the reconquest of Spain, one of the best ways, by the way, to pay off the debts of war, or to get money into your treasury quickly, rather than taxing Jews slowly, which was a very big source of income for many leaders throughout Europe, both Muslims and Christians, is let's expel them en masse. So on March 31st of 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella issue what's called the Alhambra Decree, which is telling all remaining Jews in Spain have 4 months to either become Christians or get out, which, by the way, causes a massive fire sale on everything Jewish, businesses, homes, you name it. The Jews are just, you got to get rid of everything. It's funny just to throw in something here where I'm hanging out in New York in Muncie, which is a very big Jewish shtetl with beautiful houses. And I'm telling people, eh, God forbid, and I'm not a prophet. I don't know these things. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but if there ever be such a thing going on here, your multi-million-dollar house, you might have to fire sale. This is not the first time it's happened, and people back then thought it was equal. Imagine finding out on April 1st that, oh my God, we got 4 months to get out of here. And this will lead to an event which will be very disastrous, which is the largest Jewish community in the center of the Jewish world is Spain at this part, albeit it took a big hit 100 years before, will be by July 31st, a few days later, all these Jews, and we don't have the exact numbers, how many stayed, how many left, how many converted, but I would assume that probably at least a 50-50 split, if not more stayed than converted, but maybe 100,000 or so left, and an equal number, if not more, stayed and became these B'nai Anusim, these forced converts. The ones that left uh, had a very difficult time. A lot of them invited back into the Ottoman Turkish Empire with the Sultan Bayezid. He wrote, "They tell me Ferdinand of Spain is a wise man, but he's a fool. He takes all of his treasure and sends it to me." By the way, Christopher Columbus set sail 3 days later. And there's a whole, I don't want to go into the whole story, but we now have even DNA evidence, because we can get his DNA from his descendants, that he is of Jewish ancestry. I've been saying this way before the DNA evidence. Probably a crypto-Jewish family. Whether he himself or not was Jewish is not provable, but there's all kinds of cool stuff written about it. He was looking for a westerly route to the Far East to avoid the trade routes that ran through the Muslim-controlled Silk Road. And he stumbles upon basically the Bahamas, which begins the European colonization of the New World, primarily by Spain and Portugal, but also by the Dutch and then later by the English, getting into the action very soon after. But this is all plays in. It's not an accident that Christopher, as one door is shutting, I always say, God is always, the Talmud says God puts the cure before the disease. As one door is shutting, Another one is already being opened up. Okay, in 1492, no one foresaw that America would be. By the way, in 1900, no one foresaw that America would be the last great refuge. The rabbis of Eastern Europe pre-Holocaust were telling Jews, do not go to America. It's a spiritual wasteland. They were also telling them not to go to Israel for the same reason, but that's a separate conversation. But who would see? It's amazing how you look back and how things open, the doors open, and Christopher Columbus of Jewish ancestry stumbles upon the New World literally. He had 5 Jews in his crew, by the way. One of them converted his translator, Luis de Torres, spoke, I think, 11 languages, including Hebrew, because Columbus apparently believed that he was going to stumble upon the Lost Tribes, which is another great story, which goes back 2,700 years ago when the Assyrians destroyed the entire northern kingdom. We forgot to mention that. Thank
Right.
God I stumbled on that story in my brain
Wow.
because a huge percentage of the entire Jewish people is en masse deported to what is the area of Halo and Chabad and the Gozan River, Afghanistan. That, that means, in theory, some people speculate the Pashtun, who are 25 million people living in Afghanistan, who are basically the Taliban, that they hate Israel, but they call themselves the Jewish Muslims, and they do a lot of weird things that seem to be. So it could be that that
Hmm.
is
That's
one of the
wild.
earliest examples of what is these people having stayed separate from the Jewish people for so long eventually fell victim to mass assimilation, but they're out
Hmm.
there. So that's another example of a community we don't even really deal with. But these crypto so these so as the situation in Spain changes dramatically and the Jews leave, so these crypto Jews, the ones who didn't leave and try and reestablish their Jewish identity elsewhere, whether it's in the Ottoman Turkish Empire, going to Italy, or going back to the Middle East, or back to North Africa, or to the land of Israel, by the way, which is the rebirth of a lot of the Jewish community in Jerusalem, they're going to want to try and practice their Judaism. The problem is that to practice their Judaism secretly is extremely dangerous. The Inquisition is founded in 1478 in Spain. I mean, it's to weed out heresy in general, but specifically it's targeting uh, crypto Jews. One of the reasons why there was an expulsion order given was they didn't want the people who stayed Jewish uh, interfering with the crypto Jews, the Jews who converted to Christianity, and trying to convince them to come back to their faith. If we get rid of all the authentically, openly practicing Jews, there's no opportunity. So these Jews will wean themselves off of their past Jewish connection and become true Christians, not the new Christians. But that means that you'd have these, like, people spying on you constantly to see what you're doing.
Right.
Are you eating pork or not? Are you eating only kosher meat? Are you going to church? Are you doing things that are Jewish, like blowing the shofar and stuff like that? So it's an amazing topic. I have multiple friends. Matter of fact, I'm going to Boston for Shabbat to a Persian friend of mine whose wife is a Venezuelan uh, convert, but her roots are crypto Jewish. And she told me many stories about the interesting things that her family did that are clear indications of crypto Jewish ancestry,
Hmm.
which
Wow.
that people like grandma went down to the basement to light candles Friday night. This guy told me that when his grandfather died, his dad had no idea what he was doing. He just stood in a corner and wrapped a white sheet around himself and stood in a corner, that kind of stuff. There's so many examples. This person told me that, one of the members of their family would always become a priest so they could do mass on Sunday at home instead of having to go to church. And that was like a Sunday morning brunch. They got like the New York Times and some bagels, lox, and cream cheese. So all these
Right.
things. But there was a lot of persecution. And you had the
Mm.
Inquisition. The records are recorded. You can read how these Jews are tortured and thousands are
Right.
killed. And many of them are they have called autodafés, where many of them culminated in people being burned alive for either heresy or not recanting or like, no, I'm really Jewish and I'm really not going to give up my faith, and then being burned at the stake.
Right.
So a lot of these Jews who want to return to their faith are going to look for ways to get out of. And obviously, when you're right in the middle of Spain, it's hard to do that. So that's going to lead to the migration of Jews to the New World. And remember, where the Spanish and the Portuguese are going is the New World. And by the way, in 1493, Pope Alexander VI divided the entire Western Hemisphere, basically based on a longitudinal line between Spain and Portugal. All the colonial territories, which explains why Spain has very little anywhere outside of the New World, whereas Portugal has things like in Goa, India, and interesting Portugal's colonies where they are,
Mm.
and Spain has most of the New World, where Portugal got Brazil because that's where the line ran to divide that world. But this is what's going to be colonized by Spanish and Portuguese, is the southern part of the United States, what is today Mexico and South, and the northeastern part of South America, which is today largely Brazil, but Colombia, Venezuela, these countries. And this is the earliest Jewish communities or crypto Jewish communities. They flee because maybe there we can go back to practicing our faith uh, more openly. And so, but, or there'll be less pressure. We can set up secret communities. And until today,
Right.
the oldest Jewish communities, I mean, the oldest synagogues that were surviving in the Western Hemisphere in places like Curacao, which is in the Caribbean, and
Hmm.
Kingston, Jamaica. There's a
Yeah.
synagogue that was found, it's sitting in ruins today. It was founded, I believe, in the very early 18th century. And these are communities that were founded much later when the British are controlling these places. But
Hmm.
this is where the earliest communities will try and reestablish themselves, and the Inquisition will follow them there. By the way, parts of Brazil are originally controlled by the Dutch and then conquered by the Portuguese. So the Jews will move there because in 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 1568, the Holland, which was a Spanish colony, will fight an 80-year war with Spain that's going to end in 1568. Excuse me, to I always get the dates confused. 1568 to 1648 is this 80-year war where Holland will break away and become an independent country and a Protestant country and a refuge for Jews.
Right.
So, so you have the whole story of the colonization of the New World and the whole story of the trade wars, which are open conflicts, primarily between England and to some extent Holland and Spain and Portugal, are all intertwined with this crypto-Jewish experience
Mm.
of so going back to the story you were talking about at the beginning about this person who found out they were Jewish, their ancestry almost certainly will go back to Jews who converted and wanted to escape the persecution by going all the way back to a place that was far away from the center of power of the Spanish Empire to the New World. By the way, the Inquisition didn't end in Mexico, I think, until 1823.
Mm.
So it was going on all the way into relatively modern history. But you
And that's
find,
where I guess, when we were speaking before this with different pieces of research, like where now we get conversos or hidden Jews or crypto Jews who don't know they're necessarily Jewish but have Jewish practices in places like Albuquerque and
mhm.
Santa Fe and Texas and in southern United States where there's, as you said, these communities of people who do things that are connected to Jewish practice, but have no idea that they're connected to Jewish practice, which is fascinating. I had no idea that those communities existed in the U.S.
Yeah, but but this is we're talking about massive numbers of people. You don't find them in like it's funny, the largest Jewish community in South America is in Argentina. But
Mm-hmm.
that's not some place that, okay, they speak Spanish in there, but that's far away. That's really South America is really big. So the Jewish
Mm-hmm.
community of Argentina is largely Ashkenazi and largely 20th century. Many of them are post-Holocaust. Whereas
Mm-hmm.
the northeastern side of South America, the Jewish community is mixed, Ashkenazi, Sephardi, but their origins literally go back centuries before. But as we talked about at the beginning, there are until today in those countries, in Venezuela, in Colombia, in Brazil, in all throughout Mexico and South, and all into Arizona, Texaco, Texas, New Mexico, whole communities. And what's interesting is these communities would often kind of stick together and marry within each other to preserve the identity of the community and not marry outside. I have just one anecdote. Another friend of mine lives in Israel, is married to a woman who's a Colombian convert, and she converted actually in Florida. But she told me interesting stories about their community. That the community is they speak in Colombia. Colombians have different Spanish than Argentinians or Mexicans, but even their Spanish is different than the rest of Colombia. It's one particular village. They have a lot of interesting customs that only they do. I found it very funny. She said, and they're all doctors and lawyers. It's very funny. It's like a Jewish thing, you know. So,
Amazing.
and there's apparently a movement. There are places where the whole community discovers their roots and decides they want to come back. So this is happening. Now, again, the other thing to throw in there as a side, because we talked about the 10 lost tribes, we talked about the Spanish Inquisition, we talked about the Igeret Hashmad of Maimonides' letter to the Jews of Yemen. But to the Jews, excuse me, to Maimonides' letter to the Jews of Spain. But there's also scattered around the world all these interesting communities that claim to be, like in Africa, there's the Lemba, and
Mhm.
there's different groups of people who claim to have Jewish connections. Some of these
Well,
are more
I
obvious.
was mentioning to you at the beginning about my own family, where I traced some of the roots. My mother's family is actually Acadian, so they go back all the way to the 1600s, and some of the original families that arrived in Canada. In fact, you can see my mother's um, maiden name and her mother's maiden name on the gravestones in on the East Coast from some of the original families. And when I looked into it, I found that some of those family names were actually Jewish families who were expelled from Spain, went to the south of France, and then were brought to the New World by their landowners to work and set up the new land. And it's one of the reasons, as I was mentioning, why the only peoples that have to be tested for Tay-Sachs are Ashkenazi Jews and French Canadians. And those Acadians in French Canada became the Cajuns in the southern US, and they've found many instances where they've tested their DNA and found that it's connected to Moroccan Jews, which is super interesting. So, um, yeah, I remember when I was in my conversion process, the Beit Din would ask me all the time, like, "Are you sure you're not Jewish? Are you sure you're not Jewish?" And I was like, "I'm definitely not." But there's definitely some kind of connection there, but over centuries.
But that's interesting. You mentioned the genetic issues that Ashkenazi Jews, because there was a genetic bottleneck going back 1,000 years ago. There were very few Ashkenazi Jews. I always say 1,000 years ago, 90% of the Jews in the world, their first language was Arabic, and they were living mostly in the Middle East and also in Spain and places like that. There was a big demographic switch later in history, but because you have a genetic bottleneck, when you have a small community that is uh, inbreeding within itself, because there's a lack of people to marry or they're trying to preserve their identity even secretly, you'll see that. And that's very interesting to me that Acadians would have to be tested for Tay-Sachs is a very strong support for this concept that
Mm.
they do have, that it is that they secretly, and what's amazing is that it can go on literally for these are people who have preserved on us to a certain level an independent identity for literally centuries, but most of them have actually lost the connection. They don't really realize that they are. But
Right.
this is,
God forbid, by the way, you should tell a French Canadian that they might have Jewish roots.
yeah, it's
They'll
funny because
burn you at the stake.
they also are like not the most philo-Semitic people to
Yeah.
say the least. But by the way, in Spain, the genetics of Spain, because these are the Jews who stayed in Spain, the that whole peninsula, which is Spain and Portugal, because a lot of Jews fled to Portugal, and and uh, and in a few years later, literally, it was 5 years later, 7 years later, the all the Jews of Portugal were forcibly converted. So they did genetic studies in 2008, and I believe they came up with, and wasn't the whole country of Spain, but they came up with like at least 20% of the population of Spain will have Jewish ancestry. So, so it's, but just to end with one
Wow.
more thought, because we have to end here. And obviously, I thought we'd do this in one part, and I see
Of
we're
course,
not
we're
going
going to do a part two.
to. We never, but we did. The last thing I wanted to throw in is that around the world today, we have all these well-known examples: 10 lost tribes, expulsion from
Mhm.
Spain, forced conversion under the Almohades. We didn't even talk about the Mashhadi community of Iran. We'll get to that next time. Are
Mhm.
communities that claim to be of Jewish ancestry. Some of them have much more legitimacy, like the Jews of Kaifeng in China, as a
Mhm.
community that was established over 1,000 years ago by Jewish Radhanite traders going along the Silk Road. And it took years to do these trade trips and settling out in China so they could get sweet and sour chicken soup on Friday night. So that's a community which is no longer halakhically Jewish. And I know many members of that community, but their origins are, versus people
Mhm.
like the Lemba, people in South Africa, some of whom have Jewish genetic connections. But it could just mean that a couple of Jews went to Africa and intermarried, so the DNA survives. But these are people who have a Jewish connection, whether they lost it
Right.
because they were forced out of it or because they married out of it. The story is vast. But again, we think about Ellie, that means for everyone Jewish, there are probably hundreds of millions of people in this world that have some Jewish blood there. So it's a fascinating, fascinating, fascinating story.
Amazing. All right, lots more to get into next episode. Hopefully, we'll get to that actually next week. That'd be great. Thank you as always. Super fascinating. If you have questions, if you want us to address something in particular about this topic or any other topic, please get in touch with us in the liner notes. All the information is there. Thank you so much, Rabbi Ken Spiro. Thank you, everyone, for
Yeah.
listening. And God willing, we'll see you soon.